sort of thing, and prejudice. That a little bit of that went on in their period too. Bobby Kennedy, for example, when there was a reporter for CBS was overly critical, he thought overcritically of President Kennedy. He called him a Stevenson Jew. Well, that just raised hell, and President Kennedy made him apologize, but not a word was written about it. And then President Kennedy, on one occasion, on a day in Boston, he was referring to that particular day, and he says, "It was so hot that even the niggers went to the beach." Not a word was written, although it was said to a Time magazine reporter. Compare that to what happened to poor Earl Butz. He was driven from public life. Now let me say, I'm not complaining that they didn't say that. They didn't report it. I think when a president or his attorney general and so forth happens to say something that may reveal something when he says it off the top of his head, that the press shouldn't rush it into print. But let me say that in the case of the liberals, they will cover up the press with virtually anything they can. Now maybe today it's changed a bit when everybody is panting after each other to try to get into the news, to get their stories that go out. But in that case, I must say, there was a double standard.
Do you remember how you heard about the death of Robert Kennedy?
Oh, very vividly. I was listening to the returns from California in New York because I had campaigned in California. Campaigned only because I wanted to get a big vote in the primary, which we of course got because we didn't have any opposition to speak of. But be as it may, let's stop that on the California thing. Just question again.
Do you remember how you heard about
Yes.
the death of Robert Kennedy?
Yes, I remember it particularly because I was interested in the California campaign. He had campaigned out there. After losing in Oregon, where I had seen him briefly because I had campaigned in Oregon and won heavily there, he had to win in California, and he had won. And I listened to it, and then I heard a report toward the late in the evening. It was after midnight because of the time difference, and I heard that he had been shot. But the first reports weren't all that discouraging. It indicated that he was under observation, as I recall, at the hospital. So I went to bed. The next morning, very early, Mrs. Nixon came in, and it's one of the few times I've seen her cry. And she said that poor boy died. Bobby Kennedy had died. And I thought, my God, not again. And here this nut had finished him off. In each case, an aberration. An aberration in the case of Oswald, and an aberration in the case of the one that shot Bobby Kennedy. I particularly remember, too, going to the memorial service. And that's when I told my friends, don't underestimate Ted Kennedy. I think that's the day he grew up. Before that, he'd been kind of a playboy, and he still played around a bit thereafter, as most people are quite aware. But on the other hand, he was not considered to be a very serious person. But his eulogy was eloquent. He was a man by that time. I knew from then on he would be a formidable figure in the American political scene.
From most accounts, Lyndon Johnson was a very bitter and embittered man by the time he left the White House, almost paranoid about the opponents who he felt had sabotaged him, the supporters who he felt had screwed him. Did you see any of that in your dealings with him?
Well, yes, he let his hair down with me on occasion. That was one of the reasons, for example, that he told me that he couldn't have been president unless he'd had J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, because Hoover was very important to him in terms of avoiding leaks coming from people that are supposed to have been loyal to him. Johnson had a very high standard of loyalty, incidentally. The story that illustrates that, in a true story, I understand, appeared in a recent book. One of his aides came up to him and submitted a name for appointment to some position, and Johnson said, "Is he loyal?" And the aide responded, "Well, he appears to be loyal." And Johnson said, God damn it, when I say loyal, I mean loyal. I want someone who's so loyal that he'll kiss my ass in Macy's window and tell me it smells sweet. I want someone, no, let me say that. When I say loyal, I mean loyal. I want someone who will kiss my ass in Macy's window and tell me it smells sweet. Got to repeat it because I missed something. Yeah. When I say loyal, I mean loyal. I want someone that'll kiss my ass in Macy's window and tell me it smells sweet. I want his pecker in my pocket.
That's loyal.
That's loyal. But Johnson perhaps had reason to feel that way. After all, he not only had the problem of the Bobby Kennedy people who deserted him after he had kept so many of them on after President Kennedy's death, and deserted him when Bobby Kennedy didn't get the nod for vice president. But even when some of his own proteges left him, it must have hurt him very deeply, because he was a very proud man. Bill Moyers, for example. Moyers was practically his alter ego. Moyers, who ironically today is TV's priest of higher morality as to, with regard to political activities and so forth. He was Johnson's hitman. He was the one that supervised, on Johnson's orders, an investigation of Goldwater's staff to see if, as Johnson put it, there were any fags on the staff. The reason was that they had discovered that Walter Jenkins, Johnson's top man, had homosexual background. And he was the one, this is Moyers again, who supervised the taps on Martin Luther King, which were initiated by John Kennedy, and then also proceeded to help Johnson in the cover-up of that because it might be politically embarrassing for her to get out. Then when Moyers deserted him in 1967, ostensibly because of his disenchantment about the war, it must have had a terrible impact on Johnson. So I can see why he would have been almost paranoid upon insisting on loyalty, even to the extreme that he described it.
One gets the impression that for the last months or year he was in the White House, that he was almost like a zombie. Was he effective, or was he vitiated by this kind of paranoia?
What happened to Johnson after he had reached the peak of 1964? The great victories of the states the victories of the Great Society programs, 1965, 1966. He started to go down after the midterm elections of 1966. What had happened there, briefly, is this. Johnson was unbeatable in 64 because up to the time Johnson became president in his own right, he was there always praising President Kennedy. As long as he was doing that, he got a magnificent press. He went to the grave, he did all the proper things, he had a very low profile, he was speaking always of President Kennedy and carrying out his mandate. After he was elected in his own right, he began to be Johnson, and the press began to be turned off. And then after he dropped Bobby Kennedy, even more of them turned off. And then when the war began to escalate and Johnson didn't know what to do about it, it became even worse. And those three events combined to reduce Johnson's popularity. And then he just started to flail around, and everything that he tried seemed to crumble in his hands. It wasn't before the end of 1967 that he really, I think, gave up. What caused him to give up finally was when McCarthy didn't win in New Hampshire. Many people think that Johnson was forced to resign because McCarthy beat him in New Hampshire. McCarthy didn't beat him in New Hampshire. Johnson beat McCarthy. But Johnson, the fact that McCarthy even got that many votes, because he had contempt for McCarthy and his dovish views, discouraged him, and he just decided to bug out. Drop out, I should say. From that time on, I think Johnson was sort of a pathetic figure. He wasn't the Johnson I used to know. Oh, at times he'd have a burst, and then he'd back down and so forth. But it was always deterioration from there on. And after the election, it was downhill all the way. Lord Rosebery in the 19th century, in describing Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's father, who had terminal syphilis, once said that he died by inches in public. And so it was with Johnson. He began virtually to shrivel in public. Johnson himself described it in a rather poignant way. He said, you know, President Kennedy was lucky. He was assassinated, and it was over in a day. With me, it goes on day after day, this assassination, and it's much more torturous. And I recall one thing that brought this home to me was when we had the situation with regard to the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Now, these Pentagon Papers that were going to come out, we tried to stop them from being published in the Times because we thought it would not serve the national interest. In fact, it was very harmful because it disclosed a lot of things that, in my view, were very detrimental to our bringing the war to a successful conclusion as soon as possible. But they weren't about our administration. The Pentagon Papers recounted what happened in the Johnson administration. And so we thought Johnson would join us in the lawsuit to keep the New York Times from publishing it. But Johnson said no, talking to Bryce Harlow. He said, there's nothing we can do. He says, all they're trying to do in the media is to re-execute me. That's the way Johnson felt. And I think perhaps the best indication of how disillusioned he was and how much he'd given up on his ability to control events, and particularly to do any good with the media, when the advice he gave to me toward the last about what I could do about the media attacks that were getting rougher and rougher on the war. He says, oh, there's nothing you can do about it. All you can do is to really hunker down like a jackass in a hailstorm. Now, that's not Lyndon Johnson, not the Lyndon Johnson I know. The Lyndon Johnson that I know would be a jackass who would kick his opponents right in the balls.
It's been written that it was his desire, his need to be liked or to be loved that drove him to the excesses that in turn drove people away from him and or created impossible demands for them that they couldn't possibly fulfill.
Johnson was a very proud man. One of the reasons, for example, that I think he failed in his term of presidency was his refusal to get rid of many of the people he inherited from Kennedy. They weren't his people. They didn't agree with him. They didn't want him to succeed. If he succeeded, it would make Kennedy look bad in comparison. But he didn't do it for two reasons. One, because in the beginning he needed them. He needed the mantle of Kennedy in order to build himself up. But two, he was just confident enough to think he could win them. He thought he could win the press. He knew that Kennedy had a good press, and he felt quite correctly that certainly in domestic issues, he, Johnson, was keeping Kennedy's promises. Kennedy was unable to do anything on civil rights. Johnson did it. And so it was in all the other great domestic programs that he carried forward. And so he thought, well, by God, I can win the press. And he kept fighting and fighting. He thought he could get people to love him, to like him, like they apparently had loved and liked Jack Kennedy, because he thought he was quite a fellow. And he just couldn't do it. And one time, I think again, a rather sad story, he was talking to Dean Acheson, who was never anything but blunt, and he said to him, why is it that I can't get people to like me? And Acheson said, because you're not a very likable man, Mr. President.
At the risk of being criticized for asking the fox to assess the interior decoration of the hen house, how would you compare say the Truman scandals, the 5%ers, the mink coats, the Johnson scandals, the Bobby Baker, or the Carter scandals in a way, or the Abscam scandals, which took place in the Carter administration, to the Watergate scandals?
Well, I think there's a fundamental difference. The Watergate scandals and alleged abuses of power to serve political purposes. The Truman scandals, the 5% scandals, the Johnson scandals, the Bobby Baker case, and the money that was made by Johnson and some of his colleagues, and the Carter ones to a certain extent, Burt Lange, et cetera, that involved the use of political power for financial gain. Now, that's a very substantial difference. Neither can be justified, but on the other hand, when you compare the two, you would have to say that as far as Watergate concerned, bad as it was, nobody gained anything financially except those that wrote books about it. It was for political purposes.
As largely because of your tapes, you have become known as the man who sort of brought the four-letter word to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Given some of Johnson's tremendously colorful and vital but undeniably crude language and the language of the presidents you have known, does it gall you that you have been lumbered with this dubious distinction?
No, nothing galls me. I mean, obviously the Johnson tapes will be expurgated. The Kennedy tapes will be expurgated, and they should be. Let me tell you why.
Should yours be?
Of course. Let me tell you why. We have to realize that, first, let me begin by saying every president I have known swore privately. Eisenhower did, all the rest. None of them that I have known swore publicly. Now people say, but that's hypocritical. And the point is, not at all. If I may be very direct, you don't go to the bathroom in the living room. Presidents, like anybody else, are human. And profanity comes forth when you're frustrated, and believe me, in that job sometimes you do get frustrated. I remember already we've talked about how President Kennedy was blowing his stack about what happened to Bay of Pigs, and boy, he used words that I've never heard in that place before or since. But I understood it. I would have been frustrated too, and I would have sworn about being missed. Eisenhower, I remember the time that he was so angry as we got the election returns in 1956 and found that although we had won in a landslide, we had failed to win the House and the Senate. And he says, those goddamn mossback Republicans, that's the problem. We've got to have a modern Republican Party. That's the way he would talk. Now look, why don't we have all of that out so that everybody can see? And the answer is that while presidents are human, people expect them to be more than human. People have images of their presidents, of their leaders. They want to keep those images. I want to keep them. I want a president to be able to have a private life, even to be able to swear now and then, to let his hair down. But from the standpoint of people, it's very important that they see the best side of the man. President de Gaulle understood this as well as anybody. He recounted how shortly after the fall of France, and he was that symbolic man who was going to bring France back, and he went to one of the French African colonies, and he remembered how moved he was as a huge crowd surrounded his motorcade, and they shouted, "De Gaulle, de Gaulle, de Gaulle." And he said, at that moment I understood I was two people. I was this General de Gaulle, and I was Charles de Gaulle. And from that time on, I realized I must do nothing that would not be worthy in public of this General de Gaulle. So every time I did anything, I said, would General de Gaulle approve of this or that or the other thing? And so it is with the president. And so I say, as far as I'm concerned, what a president's private life is, it should be kept private. People don't like profanity. They don't like it in their families. They certainly don't want to see it in their presidents.
A couple of months ago, you told me a story about, we were talking about Johnson, you told me about Johnson and a rattlesnake on his farm.
Oh, yeah. Well, Johnson was a legendary figure. I mean, he was bigger than life. He had enormous appetites in every way, physical, etc. And in this particular instance, I remember that there was a story that appeared in the papers. We all remembered it. In fact, some of us used it, I think probably unfairly, in the 1966 campaign. Some woman reporter was bitchy enough to ride it. She'd given him a ride. He'd given her a ride, I should say, in his car around the ranch. He used to like to get in that car and drive around his ranch. Huge ranch, you know. And he drove very fast. He did everything. He walked fast, he talked fast, he drove fast. And he was driving this car and drinking beer at the same time. And she wrote that he was driving 80 miles an hour and drinking beer out of a can in the car. Well, it raised hell, of course. And Johnson raised hell with her, I'm sure. But be that as it may, he, in driving him around the ranch, he sometimes had the bad fortune to have the reporters go with him. Maybe it wasn't bad fortune. Maybe he didn't really care. At that point, he was pretty confident he was going to survive. And he had had 2 or 3 beers, apparently, out in the ranch. It was a hot day. And he stopped at the side of the road in order to relieve himself. And he went into some bushes there, and one of the reporters called out and say, "Mr. President, aren't you afraid a rattlesnake might bite it?" He turned to him and said, "Hell, man, it is part rattlesnake." He also, of course, was big in every other way. I'll never forget my surprise, actually, when I went into the Oval Office. I was never in the Oval Office while Johnson was president. I saw him in his bedroom for coffee one morning after a gridiron dinner in 1966. Never in the Oval Office. I was in the Oval Office only once after leaving as vice president and coming back as president. That was with President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs. And I remembered so vividly President Kennedy there in the rocking chair, which of course I'd seen pictures of. So I go into the Oval Office after the election in 1968. Here's President Johnson. He's still got the rocking chair. It's twice as big as Kennedy's. Of course, he's a bigger man. I remember, too, the first time I was on Air Force One. I walked in there, and I looked at the compartment where the president's supposed to sit with his guests, and here was this huge elevated chair. It looked like a throne, and all the other chairs were sort of around it. And so I had it taken out, and I was able to put in 2 extra chairs as a result of removing the huge Johnson throne chair. Now, understand, I do not say this critically of him, but that's the way he was. He was a big man. He wanted bigger things. And another incident, I remember so well when I went to Europe the first time. When we were in London, we were to stay at Claridge's Hotel. I'd stayed at Claridge's many times. It's one of the really great hotels of the world. And I'd had this same, what they call presidential suite or king suite or whatever each time. And as I go in there, here I see the Filipino stewards around taking the bed out and putting it. I says, "What the hell are you doing?" "Oh, we're removing the bed." "What? We brought your bed from the White House to put in here." I said, "I don't need that. Why don't I use this bed?" "Oh, we always did that for President Johnson." Of course, Johnson wanted a big bed. He wasn't going to be satisfied with the big beds at the Claridge's. Well, I stopped that practice at least. But that was Lyndon Johnson.
What were your personal relations with him like?
Personal relations were very good. I'm referring now to the period after I was president and after he had left. I kind of knew how to use a former president, having been a former vice president. He was very helpful to me, and I was, I think, very considerate of him. I went out to dedicate his library. I dedicated a grove to Mrs. Johnson in California. I had him and Mrs. Johnson to the White House on several occasions for lunch, for breakfast, etc., a church service. I had him briefed regularly, and it was worth doing. As a matter of fact, he became very supportive, particularly on the war issues. I remember so well during the 1972 campaign. He was appalled about McGovern, just absolutely appalled that he was the Democratic candidate, and he thought Shriver was a silly ass. And so under the circumstances, you'd think he would endorse me, but he made a very interesting comment to Bryce Harlow. He says, "Well," he says, "I'm for him, but I'm not going to say anything publicly." He says, "After all, I've been sucking at the tit of the Democratic Party so long that I'm not going to let go now simply because the milk's turned sour because of what the poor cow is eating." That's the way Lyndon Johnson would put it, of course.
How did you hear about his death?
It was a very dramatic moment we were just holding and waiting to see whether or not the Vietnamese would sign the peace agreement which we had negotiated. And we learned it on the night of the 22nd, that the agreement signing would take place on the 23rd, and then the formal signing on the 27th when Secretary Rogers were to go over to Paris. And Henry Kissinger brought me the news that President Johnson had just died. And what concerned me about that was that I knew that above everything else in his final days, he wanted to be sure that the war had been brought to an honorable conclusion, because he knew his place in history would be determined by that. And I wondered if he really knew, because we hadn't announced anything yet. And I asked Kissinger later, I said, did he know? And Kissinger said, I think he did. Kissinger says, I went down to see him on the 15th to brief him. And I told him on the 15th that that President Nixon had ordered that the bombing be halted. He said, Johnson smiled. He said, I know what that means. Nixon would never stop that bombing unless he had a deal. Now, there's another reason Johnson said it. I remember a conversation I had with him back in 1969 at breakfast, and he was berating Harriman. He said, that son of a bitch Harriman told me 12 times when I stopped the bombing that if we'd only stop it, he knew that the Russians would help and the Vietnamese would cooperate, and it didn't do any good. Every single bombing halt was a terrible mistake. So therefore, he got the message. He knew before he died that the long war that he had tried so desperately to bring to a conclusion, but had only succeeded in escalating, had been brought to a conclusion. And of course, he could have felt then that maybe his place in history would be restored.
Looking back from the, say, the perspective of the turn of the century, how will the man in the street in the year 2000 assess John Kennedy's contribution to American, to world history? How will John Kennedy have made a difference?
Well, I think the way really that question is often put to me, which is rather than what the man in the street's going to do, because who is the man in the street? That's one of hundreds of millions, and so forth. You usually hear this, what I think rather fatuous question, what is history going to say? How is he going to look in history, or and so forth? And here's something we have to understand about what is history. How does history judge John Kennedy? How is history going to judge Lyndon Johnson? How is it going to judge Richard Nixon? That is beside the point. You've got to find out what history is, and this impersonal history we talk about. I remember when, after I had resigned the presidency, I made the resignation speech. Henry Kissinger walked over to the residence with me. And as we were walking along, he was rather emotional, and he said, because of your foreign policy, I am confident that you will be rated as a great president in history. I said, Henry, that depends on who writes the history. Winston Churchill understood that. Winston Churchill said, history is going to treat me well because I intend to write it. And he did. When we talk about history, what we have to recognize that history is not a single impartial judge. The verdict of history is rendered by a jury of historians. And historians in the United States are overwhelmingly liberal, and to the extent they have party affiliations, are overwhelmingly democratic. And in addition, because their bread and butter is style, they are suckers for style, obsessed with style. Style is more important to them than his substance. Now, in answering the question with regard to what President Kennedy's place in history will be, I would say it will be very good, because historians have to be impressed by his style. He's got to get AA figures for style in every which way. They've got to be impressed by his charisma. Historians like charisma. As far as his record is concerned, they will gloss over that to an extent, because the record is not particularly impressive. He was not able to accomplish anything particularly domestically. Johnson was the one that carried through on the Kennedy promises. He was the performer. Kennedy was the promiser. And in foreign policy, the Kennedy foreign policy could only be described as being almost disastrous. Kennedy's legacy is a Castro with a privileged sanctuary in Cuba and raising hell all over the world. As far as Vietnam was concerned, his legacy is the assassination of Diem, the musical chairs that followed, 15,000 combat troops assigned there, the beginning of a war that took years and years to end. But on balance, historians, not history, but historians in that broad context will rate him very, very high. A British historian, Paul Johnson, makes the blunt statement that Kennedy was a weak president. I don't agree with that. I think had he lived, that Kennedy would have become more Irish and less Harvard as he went along, and would have done a more effective job with regard to both Castro and Vietnam and other things than he'd done earlier. But not having lived, he will have to take, of course, in historically speaking, some of the criticism which has been leveled at him for his failures, particularly in Cuba and in Vietnam.
From the same perspective, or the perspective of history, not from the man of the street, how will Lyndon Johnson fare at the turn of the century?
Well, historians are turned off by Lyndon Johnson's style. Turned off partly because he's got a Southern accent. Incidentally, I think Jimmy Carter has suffered from that too. It's not fair. Historians generally don't, if they come from the South, they develop Harvard accents if they possibly can. The elitist, that sort of approach to things in terms, and it's the fashionable way to talk and to act and to write and so forth is not Southern. Let's face it. Not fair, but that's the way it works. So they don't like Johnson's style, so that hurts him. They don't like him in comparison to Kennedy. That hurts him. In terms of what he accomplished, they don't like him because of the war in Vietnam. And then, however, you've got to balance that by what he did. And what he did on the domestic scene was something that made a difference. And I refer to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Just as I could go to China, where Hubert Humphrey, the liberal, could not, so only Johnson could have gotten the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. Johnson, a Southerner who had voted against civil rights during the 1950s when I was presiding over the United States Senate. And that was his monumental achievement. He deserves great credit for that. And maybe by the turn of the century, honest historians, and there are some, I'm sure, that will be honest, who look back and say Johnson gets high marks for that, for doing what Kennedy promised but did not produce on the civil rights area.
How do you think Richard Nixon is going to fare?
Well, as far as historians are concerned, again having in mind that most of them are liberal, most of them are democratic in terms of party persuasion, and most of them are obsessed by style, I'm going to strike out on all three scores. I'm not a Democrat, I'm not liberal, and my style does not appeal to them. And so under the circumstances, apart from Watergate, which of course will be a very big negative, the administration that I headed will not get the credit perhaps that it deserves for some great events that did make a difference. Henry Kissinger, at the time we went to China, at the time we ended the war in Vietnam, he'd come into the office and emote about his friends from Harvard. He said, they can't bear the thought that you did it. They can't bear the thought that you did it. Well, I said, what difference does it make? It'll look all right historically. And that, of course, is irrelevant now. But nevertheless, when you look at the events, the actual accomplishments, they are not insignificant. The opening to China, that made a difference. It changed the world. The new relationship with the Soviet Union, the first arms control agreement, whether you like it or not, it made a difference. Ending the war in Vietnam, and during the balance of my presidency, not losing anything to the communists, that made a difference. Reestablishing relations with Egypt, saving Israel in 1973, laying the foundation, therefore, for the Egyptian rapprochement. That made a difference. Domestically, and many people are not aware of these domestic accomplishments because we're primarily known for the foreign policy accomplishments. The most important achievement, without question, were the appointments to the Supreme Court. We left a lot of blood on the floor, but we changed history in the United States, and I think for the better as a result of those 4 very, very good appointments. Next to that, and very next to it, very close to it, was the peaceful desegregation of Southern schools. That could not have been accomplished by anybody other than, I believe, a conservative who had credentials in the South and yet who also was strong for civil rights. Beyond that, I think as time goes on, our cancer initiative may historically make a difference. It has made some already. What we did, for example, in environment and hunger, I don't think can be classified like that because that would have happened anyway. We were just happened to preside when it did happen. Revenue sharing, that principle, might not have happened had we not done it, but some even question whether it should. But the overwhelming evidence would have to be that on China, on Russia, on Vietnam, on the Mideast, the Supreme Court, these things all made a difference. Now that seems like a very formidable record. But on the negative side, as I say, we have the whole Watergate, which of course made a difference on the negative side. Now how's that all going to sort out as far as historians are concerned? Negatively. Negatively because most historians are negative toward the individual, toward me, just as they are toward Lyndon Johnson. He isn't going to get a good shake historically from historians, and neither will I.
In 1968, in Miami, when you announced that your choice for vice president was Spiro Agnew, there was a resounding chorus, "Spiro who?" Looking back now, was that the right choice?
Well, you know, I would be expected to say that it was, and I do say that it was. First of all, I had to have somebody who was a bridge between North and South. I did not want a Southerner because I didn't have a qualified Southerner. If I'd have had a qualified one, I'd put him on there because it was time for the South to be on that ticket, on a Republican ticket. But Agnew, coming from a border state, met that. Second, Agnew, we forget now, had very good credentials as a, quote, moderate, end quote, Republican. He had defeated a racist Democrat. He was highly praised in the New York Times editorially for having done so after he was elected governor in Maryland. And so, and in terms of Agnew himself, he was an able man. He was intelligent. He was a well-trained lawyer. He was a fighter for what he believed and served well as vice president. Now let's look at the negatives there, and let's put it in the context since we're speaking historically here. Agnew, unfortunately, had been governor of Maryland. Maryland, realistically, for as long as anybody can remember, had been a state in which contractors doing business to the state were asked to and gladly complied with provisions to kick back part of the amounts they got for their contracts into funds to be used by the governor for his political purposes. And to an extent, since the governor wasn't paid that much, even to take care of some of his personal expenses. Now that wasn't limited even, however, to Maryland. That's happened in many other states. Adlai Stevenson, according to John Barlow Martin, his biographer, had a fund of $60,000 which was taken from contractors doing business with the state of Illinois, which was used to pay for some of his charitable contributions, used to pay for parties that he gave for his staff, a dance that he gave for some of his children, and so forth and so on. It was considered perfectly proper in his case. Agnew did it. Now, there was nothing to indicate that Agnew ever did anything as vice president for which he took money. But because some of the money that was supposed to be contributed by the contractors was delivered to him after he became vice president, so he was forced to resign. Was it a double standard? Yes. Why was it worse in that Agnew's case? Because he had the temerity to take on the press. There was no one, even more than I. Agnew was a target. Agnew was a target because he'd been effective against the press. And, understandably, once they caught him in what they thought was a politically vulnerable activity, they hung him out to dry. But I think in terms of that very time and up to the time that occurred, that Agnew conducted himself in a dignified and effective way as vice president.
If it's common knowledge that this is the way, that this is politics as usual in Maryland and other states in that region or of that kind, couldn't you have, or shouldn't you have, or did you anticipate that he had this problem or might have this problem?
Well, I didn't anticipate it because I did not dream that he would have continued to accept the contributions after he became vice president. See, that's what made it, that's what gave it the problem, receiving the contribution while he was vice president.
So to that extent, he
I
deserved to what
No,
happened?
I still think it was a double standard. I think he deserved certainly some condemnation, but I do not believe that he deserved the almost hysteria that went on in the U.S. Attorney's Office and everything else, that he had committed the crime of the century. It had happened in Illinois, and I'm sure it happened in a lot of other states. It doesn't happen in California, I can assure us. They haven't grown up to that sort of thing there yet, but I'll bet you it's still going on in some of these states.
But this was on a new level in that it, whatever may have been happening in state houses, this was the White House or the office of the vice president. This raised it to a national level.
The contribution had been earned, shall we say. The contractor had been hands laid on him to make the contribution before he ever got, however, to vice president. It wasn't done while he was vice president. It was delivered. The money was delivered. It just wasn't. But it was the services performed for the money, i.e., the contract, occurred long before he became vice president of the United States.
If you felt it was a bum rap, why'd you let him go, or why didn't you stop him from going?
There was nothing that we could do to stop him with the problems that I had at that particular time. There was nothing I could do for him. I only wish I'd been stronger. If I had been, I would have stopped it.
How do you think history will look back and assess Mrs. Nixon?
I think quite well. After some of my candid comments about the press, I think they are going to have a great problem in not giving her her due. I think the fact that although she has done nothing in the public arena since we left Washington, that she's still rated in most of the polls among the top most admired women in the world, in the Good Housekeeping poll and so forth, has got to tell us something that she has legacy. Let me say, I don't know about history, but I know how I would rate her. I've known a lot of first ladies, and incidentally, I've admired them and respected each in his own way. Each contributed in her own way. The first one I knew was Mrs. Herbert Hoover, a very lovely lady. I knew her when we were both served on the board of Whittier College. But looking at Mrs. Nixon, I think these are the characteristics that sort of set her apart. First, she has an unusual combination, beauty and brains. Now, I have found that generally speaking, girls that are beautiful don't have much upstairs, and those that have brains are not very pretty. I know there's a great argument in television today about whether or not the television networks are hiring women simply because they're good looking, and of course they are. Take, for example, Jean Kirkpatrick at the United Nations, probably the most intelligent women, or one of the most intelligent in the U.S., and very articulate. You think she'd ever have a chance to be on a network show? No way. She isn't good looking enough. She is, in my view. She'd never make it. Of course they picked that. But Mrs. Nixon, without question, had great beauty, and she's also very smart. Cum laude graduate of the University of Southern California, worked her way through on a fellowship, orphaned when she was 17 years of age, took care of her brothers, did the cooking and so forth and so on. A hard life in those early years in order to get through school and get an education, taught school, married, continued to work, made it possible for me to enter politics and so forth. That's enough of the background. But apart from the beauty and the brains and the background, there's another characteristic that's a little harder to describe. I'll never forget when I was in China in 1978. We were riding a train from a city in the southern part of China up to Peking. And there was a Chinese woman, a young woman, who was my guide and translator. She was the tough partisan type, as they always are when they assign them to you. Not very feminine at all. And she said to me as we were riding along in the train in the compartment, she said, "How is Mrs. Nixon?" Because Mrs. Nixon by that time had had a stroke. And I said, "Well, she's recovering very well." And she said, "We in China have great respect for her. She is such a strong person, such a strong person." And what she meant by that was that here you had someone who had developed strength from the time she was in school, who had a tough life when she was growing up, who showed great strength in my political career in the fun crisis way back in 1952, in Caracas when she sat there just as cool as if it were a Sunday afternoon tea rather than a life-threatening crisis, who went through the defeat in 1960, the defeat in 1962, the resignation, and still just glided along as the lady that she is. I think that impressed the Chinese. It certainly impressed me. And then another thing I would say about Mrs. Nixon. Now the women's libbers are not going to like what I'm going to say now. They're not going to like it at all. But I remember something I read in Winston Churchill's great contemporaries about Asquith, the British Prime Minister in the early years of World War I. He said his greatest legacy is his children. Her greatest legacy are her children. She's been a magnificent mother. It's hard for children of celebrities, particularly presidents, vice presidents, to grow up a normal life. People who are children of celebrities turn out to be groupies or drugs, alcohol, or even worse. Patricia and Julie are remarkable young ladies, and I was away a lot, and she certainly gets the credit for that. So I would say that all in all, because of her brains, her beauty, which of course she inherited, because of her great strength, because she was a very fine example as far as being a mother is concerned, on all this she deserves credit. Now let's look at the downside, however. The ladies in the press, and some of the men as well who covered, criticized Mrs. Nixon very cruelly, and this hurt her incidentally. Shouldn't have, but it did. She should have considered the source. But they said it's plastic Pat. And why? Because she never said anything. She didn't make speeches. She didn't make an ass of herself in public. That's what they want. They want a story. Or fall down drunk or some other damn thing. But she wouldn't do that. And they said, why didn't she make speeches? That shows she doesn't have a mind of her own. It's not true at all. She's just smart. She knows you can't have two voices out of the White House. She had ideas, and she expressed them privately. And another thing it shows, which these critics among the ladies in the press, what they wouldn't understand, and they won't appreciate at all, she was self-assured and self-confident. She didn't have such a big ego that she had to go out and prove that she had a career in her own right. To her, what was important was the career of her husband. She served as First Lady with all of these thoughts in mind, and she set an example that was splendid. Her travels abroad, all of these, her performances in the White House, and I would say finally as a campaigner, one thing that brought that home to me. Back in 1952, I was speaking, I remember out in Kansas, and Harry Darby, who served for a short time in the Senate, was introducing Mrs. Nixon, Pat as he called her, to a big, huge rally there. And he said, our candidate for vice president, Senator Nixon, he's controversial, but everybody loves Pat. And I thought that was a high compliment to a great campaigner.
You had mentioned a couple of days ago an interesting insight that de Gaulle had into the difference between Kennedy and Johnson.
De Gaulle put it,
or can you do it as a sentence?
De Gaulle, in referring to Kennedy and Johnson, de Gaulle made, I thought, a very profound comment. He said, Kennedy was a mask on the face of America. Johnson was America. I must say, incidentally, on Johnson, another recollection I have of him that always brings a smile to my face was the time we had breakfast in 1969. He was bitching to me about an article in Look magazine about his brother. He says, you know, my brother's sort of a black sheep. He says, every family's got one. He said, I know, for example, he said that I had this contractor friend down in Texas, and he said he had a no-good brother, he says, who just couldn't hold a job. And his mother came to him and begged him to hire that dumb brother and give him a job. He said, oh, well, he finally relented, and he did. You know what he did? Well, he gave him a job driving a load of dynamite across the state. Well, the fellow stopped at a roadside bar, had 6 beers, propositioned the waitress to marry him, and then drove on down the road. You know what happened? He drove smack dab into a telephone pole.
Do you think of yourself as old?
Not yet, but that's because I've survived so long.
De Gaulle said that old age is a shipwreck. Do you see yourself as, since you don't see yourself as old, you don't see yourself as shipwrecked, but do you see yourself headed towards shoals or sandbars?
I'm very fatalistic. I think when I leave the scene, it will be suddenly. Let me say, I don't want to go and don't intend to go gradually.
De Gaulle, as early as 20 or more years, as early as 1950, had laid out an elaborate, although very simple, but an elaborate plan for his funeral, where he wanted to be buried, who he wanted to be there, what he wanted his epitaph to be. Have you done that?
No, I have. I've been giving the protocol office, I guess they call it, the White House, I've given them fits because they've been out after me time and again to approve some darn plan, and I'm not going to do it. I just don't like to look forward that far.
In 1968, as you've said when you were considering whether or not to run for president, Tricia said that the reason you should run was that if you didn't, you wouldn't have anything to live for, and you've said that that was true at the time. What do you have to live for now?
Well, what a former president can contribute is, I would say, marginal. I mean, we get a lot of guff to the effect that, well, everybody's hanging on every word that a former president says, and former presidents are great national assets, and that's all a bunch of nonsense. It's not really true. A former president can contribute, not because he's a former president, but if he knows something a little bit more than somebody else. Having been president, it may give you temporarily a forum, but once they find out there's nothing up here, or that you've got nothing to say, they quit paying attention to you. So I would say that as long as I can keep current with events and have something to say that could make a difference, I may influence the course of events. Once I decide that I no longer have the energy or maybe the understanding to comment on current events in a way that could influence the course of events, influence decisions made by the President, Secretary of State, and whatever. Once that occurs, then I will quietly recede from the political scene. But as far as the future is concerned, I have, again, a rather philosophical and almost fatalistic view about it. Walter Annenberg, our former ambassador to England, once told me shortly after I resigned the presidency, and I was down a bit, understandably, and he was trying to buck me up. And he said, remember, life is 99 rounds, 99 rounds, and whoever's standing at the end is going to win. Well, I'm still standing at 70, and I expect to stand again, I trust, for a few more years, maybe 99 rounds.
Looking back on the last 70 years, do you count the last 36 or 7 hours we've spent here together in the studio as one of the highest of the high points?
Well, let me say we've discussed the high points, but whether I'd put this at a high point, I'm not sure. I wonder if we missed something on Johnson there. Let's see. Well, that's enough. We're through.
Do you, if anything you want to...
What was it on Johnson? Let's see. What other... Let's see. I know. You covered all the Johnson points you
I think
want.
we had, yeah.
Good. That's enough. We got our pictures. I think we trotted through that in good shape.
Yes. A lot of ground.
Stay right there for 1 second. I need to do a couple of cell checks.
If,
Oh, sanitizing the record.
you got that. You said that. You talked about expurgating all the stuff.
Maybe I did. I don't think so.
Do you want to
His
come into
warts
it?
are bigger than...
Roger,
If you've got, if they could
can
bring
we
it
come
up.
back for 1 point?
Switch the lights, please. Keep the tapes rolling.
I think it just, well, I'd like to make it again. All right, I'll finish
Make
this.
it specific.
3 minutes, right.
It seems that the kind of vibrant Johnson you've described hasn't come across, and the record is that he spent a lot of time while he was still alive expurgating his own memoirs. Does this bother you?
I understand that Johnson not only expurgated his memoirs, but that since then, those that are running his library and have his papers are expurgating his tapes, his memoirs, and everything else. They're going to sanitize him so that he comes through like every other bland, moderate, so-called mushy moderate politician. And I would say that they're rendering him a terrible disservice. He's just going to be an homogenized type like those that populate the House and Senate and many of the state houses today. Johnson was different. And they should let people see him as he was, warts and all. Because I'll say one thing for sure. Johnson's warts were bigger than most of those in the political scene today.
We've made it sound like it was almost inevitable that you would win the 1968 nomination for president as the result of this comeback. But was that the case? Did you have a battle for the nomination?
Oh yes, Nelson Rockefeller was in there in and out over and over again, and he had a huge amount of money. He spent more in that nomination period than we spent for the entire campaign in 1968. And then also Ronald Reagan was making a little run at it from the coast. He was not in it so much, but his people were pushing him hard. I'll never forget what brought this home after we won the nomination. And Nelson Rockefeller called to congratulate me. And he always gets a hoarse voice. I mean, he's very enthusiastic type when he's on election nights. Every time I've talked to him, his voice is hoarse. His voice is very hoarse. He says, "Congratulations, Dick, congratulations." And he said, I said, "Well, you ran a good race, Governor. You gave us a little bit of a scare." He said, "Yeah, well, Ronnie didn't do quite as well as we hoped he would."
What was that?
Well, he